All right, welcome to Moderate Rebels. I'm Max Blumenthal, and I'm here with Ben Norton, who is in Quito, Ecuador. Ben has been covering the first round of a historic presidential election in Ecuador, where it appeared that the pink tide that had receded in past years across Latin America and has been returning would sweep through Ecuador next with a victory by Andrés Arauz, who is essentially the successor to the socialist-oriented former President Rafael Correa. And for the past year or so, past several years, Ecuador has been under the control of a Trojan horse figure who is the former VP to Correa, Lenin Moreno, who has instituted an administration of harsh repression against his opponents, implemented IMF austerity policies, mass privatization, had a disastrous performance on COVID. And this all fueled the popularity of Arauz. But we've seen a very interesting and unusual, and I would say deeply disturbing result in the first round that Ben's going to talk about. Ben has been covering the election for the past week, and several of his articles have really broken through and helped explain to people what is actually happening and hinted very strongly that the U.S. has already interfered in this historic election. Ben made a really important documentary for us at the Gray Zone. It's sort of a mini documentary or a long report. It's about 15 minutes long. You can find it at our YouTube channel, and it's on the site, thegrayzone.com. But I wanted to just, before bringing Ben in, just lead in with part of that documentary because I think it really helps explain the background for this election very well. So let's just go to that real quick.
The South American nation of Ecuador is currently suffering through its worst economic crisis in decades. Poverty is skyrocketing, corruption is rampant, and the US-backed government has shown itself to be deeply undemocratic. On February 7th, Ecuador will hold a historic election that could fundamentally change its direction, moving the nation away from its current neoliberal policies and reliance on Washington, and restoring the socialist-oriented program of former President Rafael Correa, who launched a progressive movement called the Citizens' Revolution. Today, Ecuador's sitting president, Lenin Moreno, has a mere 8% approval rating, making him the most unpopular leader in the country's modern history. Under Moreno's rule, the government has imprisoned and exiled many left-wing political leaders, banned pro-Correa electoral candidates, gutted social programs, destabilized Latin American regional institutions, and heavily indebted Ecuador with billions of dollars in loans. And in a historic act of betrayal, Moreno renounced the asylum that Correa had given to WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange, allowing British authorities to enter Ecuador's sovereign embassy in London and arrest the Australian journalist. Unemployment, inequality, and hardship have reached peak levels, with more than 58% of Ecuadorians living in poverty and nearly 39% in extreme poverty, according to the United Nations. Meanwhile, Ecuadorians have endured a catastrophic response to the COVID-19 pandemic, with one of the highest per capita death rates. In 2020, Ecuador's GDP shrunk by an estimated 11%. For sale and for rent signs are visible on properties throughout the capital of Quito. I visited Ecuador this February to cover its election and speak with citizens who have borne the brunt of the economic crisis overseen by the country's US-backed government.
Okay, so Ben, I expected Arauz, the leftist candidate, the socialist candidate, the most popular candidate, to win in the first round. I think he did as well. The polls that his people were conducting ahead of election night had him at about 38%, which would have put him way over the top. But for some reason, the election is going to a second round. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the three major candidates and what went wrong and why it's seemingly very disturbing.
Yeah, well, thanks, Max. You really started off well by stressing the situation here with Lenin Moreno. And to understand the election, we have to understand that this current government is probably the least popular government in modern Ecuadorian history. Lenin Moreno has 8% approval and 91% disapproval. I mean, we're talking about like just comical levels of corruption, just one of the worst COVID crises in the entire world in terms of deaths per capita. Last year in 2020, the GDP of Ecuador shrunk by 11%. According to the United Nations, poverty levels have risen to 56%. They've doubled under Lenin Moreno. So, I mean, we're talking about the looting of a country. This is like what happened to the former Soviet Union after neoliberal shock therapy was imposed by Yeltsin. I mean, I was talking to some Ecuadorians last night. Today is February 10th, so it's been 3 days since the election. Last night, some Ecuadorians were telling me that this is the worst economic crisis since 1999, and might even be worse than that. And in 1999, for emphasis, the entire economy was destroyed. The currency was destroyed. At that time in 1999, the economic minister was a banker, a very corrupt banker named Guillermo Lasso, who is actually one of the main presidential candidates I'll talk about in a second. And he oversaw like the liquidation of the Ecuadorian economy. Anyone who held their life savings in the local currency, which was most people who weren't like rich oligarchs, they lost their life savings. It just was destroyed. And Guillermo Lasso and his banker friends made billions of dollars basically gambling on the economy, and that led to dollarization. So here in Ecuador, since 1999, since 2000 actually, the US dollar has been the official currency of the country. But we're talking about an economic collapse that parallels what was happening in 1999. And like Lenin Moreno, the figure who oversaw that corruption in 1999, is a major politician here today in Ecuador. His name is Guillermo Lasso. And he was leading in all of the polls as the second place candidate. Max, you mentioned that the first place candidate in all the polls was Andrés Arauz, the leftist economist. He's a young leader, it's young blood, but he follows in the footsteps of the former President Correa. Well, what's interesting, though, is that Lasso, it's still not entirely clear who came in second, but since the election night on the 7th, there's been a candidate who was in second who was actually leading pretty significantly behind in all the polls, and his name is Yaku Perez. Now, Yaku Perez is portrayed as a progressive environmentalist, but we can talk about this, Max, and this is not entirely a new project. He's totally a Trojan horse. I mean, you mentioned that term, Trojan horse. In many ways, Yaku Perez is very similar to Lenin Moreno because Lenin Moreno actually came out of the Correísta movement and portrayed himself as a successor of Correa. He was the former vice president, and he did a complete 180 when he entered office after the 2017 election. He imprisoned, persecuted, exiled Correísta activists. The former vice president under Correa, because he had two vice presidents, Moreno and also this guy, Jorge Glass, he's in prison right now on bogus charges. He was imprisoned. He went on hunger strike for over 50 days. He nearly died. He was hospitalized, and he's still in prison. So we're talking about massive repression. And the other candidate who has come out of nowhere is very similar to that. He portrays himself as this progressive candidate, but really, I mean, he's deeply right-wing, and he's very closely tied to the United States. So ironically, I mean, you alluded to this, the U.S. has played a role meddling in this election in a lot of ways, but ironically, of the three main candidates, two of them are backed by Washington. One is like the more traditional right-wing oligarch, Guillermo Lasso, but the other is this kind of new Trojan horse candidate, and we've seen campaigns like this in Nicaragua and in Brazil and even in Venezuela. He's like the NGO left. He's like the Kamala Harris of Ecuador. I mean, really, if you had to pick a comparison, Yaku Perez is the Kamala Harris of this country.
Well, I think I want to put up on the screen a picture of what he looked like before when he was he used to be Carlos Perez, right?
Carlos
And
Perez, yeah.
He looked just like any other candidate, and he was a lawyer, and he had glasses and short hair, and he just like when you're around Latin America at election time, there are just signs everywhere that'll just show some guy's face with their name and a check mark next to it, and it's hard to even keep track of them. And they're like 32 candidates, and like half of them are named Carlos, and it's like,
and they'll all have like these buzzwords like prosperidad, economía, trabajo,
esperanza,
but
we believe, creemos, something. And this is what he was, and he went nowhere with it. So he changed his whole look. He like went into the NGO phone booth and came out with a new costume with long hair, and he's wearing like
very
indigenous garb. Yeah, hippie style. And his name is Yaku. He's like, someone who he might as well have a mate gourd and just have like world music themes accompanying him through like cafes in Berkeley. It's like, it's weird. It's like was perfectly tailored for the US rad lib sector. Like he could have fit in perfectly at some talk about eco-socialism at the Verso Loft or something. I have considered him a marginal candidate. I'm shocked that he went as far as he did, but you wrote a very prescient profile of Yaku Perez, Carlos Yaku Perez, which highlighted how much institutional support he's been receiving straight from the United States government and various cutouts. I mean, we're talking about the National Endowment for Democracy, National Democratic Institute. He's close to Fernando Villavicencio, who we've talked about before, who is this very spooky character who has been supported by the US government and was used to destroy WikiLeaks and participated in the Guardian smear campaign against Assange. So the tentacles go very deep. And then you wrote about his wife, Manuela Peak, who's, plays the role of our NGO Radlib very well.
She's probably been in the Verso Loft. I would bet she's been in the Verso Loft.
I mean, I actually didn't know who. I was familiar with her work before your article because Truthout republished this monstrosity that was written in basically ahead of the coup in Bolivia, generating momentum for the coup because of the fires in the Amazonia, in the Amazon rainforest, seeking to blame it on Evo Morales. And the title of her article was Evo's Ecocide is a Genocide. And Truthout republished that, and I was just infuriated. I was just filled with anger seeing that headline in a ostensibly progressive publication. And then a few weeks later, the right-wing, very violent coup happened. Evo was almost killed. So she was sort of part of that campaign, and now she's here, and now the pieces are starting to really come together. So explain the institutional support behind Perez, how he got to where he is, which is making him, a contender for the presidency and apparently a really important piece in the wall that the U.S. is trying to erect to prevent the pink tide from returning.
Yeah, well, I should first of all say that today is February 10th, and the results are still not clear. You mentioned some of the irregularities in this election. A lot of Ecuadorians I've spoken to, even people who are not supporters of the Correísta movement, they have said that this is the least transparent, most disorganized election they've ever seen. I mean, it's been insane. So on election day, on the 7th, there were lines for hours, especially in working class communities that tend to support Correa and his movement. I went to 4 different precincts here in Quito, in the capital, and I went to some in working class areas and some middle class, kind of upper middle class areas. And it's very clear that in like the upper middle class areas, people could vote much more easily. The lines were way shorter, it was really quick. And the precincts in the poorer areas were really badly organized, and people were waiting for like an hour or two just to vote. Also, voting in Ecuador is mandatory. Unlike obviously not in the US, but that's true for some other Latin American countries. So it was interesting to see that. And then, of course, there's also massive voter suppression before. The electoral body here that runs the election is called the CNE, the National Electoral Council. It's extremely politicized. I mean, to such a degree, it's like what the US says about Venezuela. They're like, Chavez handpicked these officials and they don't let anyone who's not a Chavista run in the election. I mean, it's a ridiculous lie. Everything they say about Venezuela is true about here. I mean, the CNE, for instance, when I got here in the last week of January, so about almost 2 weeks before the election. And what was wild is that I saw a bunch of reports. The CNE was making it really hard for Ecuadorians abroad to vote. And there's more than 1 million Ecuadorians abroad. So a lot of them are pro-Correa. So there was a lot of voter suppression targeting them. And then the CNE also was trying to strip the electoral observer credentials from members of the European Parliament who came from Spain, and because they were affiliated with the left, which according to the Lenin Moreno government makes them criminals if you're part of the left. So we also saw that the CNE, the electoral body, prevented Andrés Arauz, the left-wing candidate. They blocked his political party from participating. So he had to use like a minor political party that people didn't even know about that had already been registered with the government. And there was a politician that was friendly to Correa. So they used that party in order to run. And then also, the CNE prevented Correa from being a vice presidential candidate. He wanted to be the vice president for Arauz, but was blocked. So we're talking about massive levels of voter suppression. But what's interesting about the CNE, a detail that hasn't been publicized, of course, who is the head of the National Electoral Council overseeing the elections in Ecuador? It's a former National Assembly representative from a party called Pachakutik. Pachakutik is the party of Yaku Perez. And what's really interesting is that she also worked for the World Bank before she joined Pachakutik. Pachakutik, you mentioned like this eco-socialist marketing. Pachakutik was founded in the 1990s before Correa was even a politician. And it is the political arm of an indigenous organization here in Ecuador, which is very kind of anarchist-oriented. It's very critical of the state, even when socialists are in charge, and it's very critical of extractivism, as they call it. And this has become super popular among the kind of NGO left, people like Naomi Klein and people around AOC and the Green New Deal. That they always criticize extractivism, meaning countries using their natural resources, extracting them through, whether it's oil or mining, and then selling it, and then using that money to fund social programs and to fight poverty and to fund education and healthcare. Now, ironically, you never hear them talk about extractivism for social democracies in Northern Europe, like in Scandinavia, which often, actually, a lot of the sovereign wealth fund of these countries does come from oil. But they're allowed to be extractivists because they're in pro-imperialist countries that work with NATO. But when it comes to Venezuela or Ecuador, they're demonized as petro-populist. And like Venezuela, here in Ecuador, there are huge oil reserves. And also there's gold, silver, copper, tungsten. There's other minerals that Correa, the government, had used from 2007 to 2017 to fund these social programs, to fight poverty and all these things. So Pachakutik was one of the main political forces in opposition to Correa when he was in office. But the thing is, they pretended to be kind of like left-wing opposition, criticizing him for mining and for not being an environmentalist. But they don't have a program for developing the country. I mean, they claim to be left-wing, but they frequently ally with the right wing, and this is where Yaku Perez comes in. In 2017, Yaku Perez, who is he's part of this party, Pachakutik, in 2017, he endorsed the right-wing banker candidate, Guillermo Lasso. This is actually the third election that Guillermo Lasso has run in. Back in 2012, when he was a candidate again for president, Guillermo Lasso, who was his vice president? His vice president was a former member of Pachakutik, the so-called eco-socialist. He was an indigenous leader who volunteered to be vice president for the banker to run against Rafael Correa. So we see clear examples of this so-called eco-socialist party that Yaku Perez represents openly allying with the right-wing oligarch banker. I mean, it's really incredible. But meanwhile, in the U.S., all these people promote, like people on the left, and, I think a lot of them are well-intentioned, but they think that Arauz now is not the real left-wing candidate. And they say, like, Extinction Rebellion is an example. This is this environmental group, kind of anarchist-oriented, deeply critical of states in general, including left-wing governments in Latin America. And Extinction Rebellion, as we reported at the Gray Zone, and Wyatt Reed, our colleague, reported, Extinction Rebellion helped support protests against Evo Morales, the first and only ever indigenous president of Bolivia, trying to blame him for fires in the Amazon rainforest that were largely caused by Brazilian companies, because the far-right president there, Jair Bolsonaro, who called himself Captain Chainsaw, was encouraging companies to destroy the Amazon. So Extinction Rebellion, after helping unwittingly, I think, I don't think they're, I don't think they know what's going on, but they're well-intentioned, but they have this ultra-left politics that makes it useful to these institutions that are trying to destabilize left-wing governments in Latin America. Well, Extinction Rebellion just published an article last week, a few days before the election, praising Yaku Perez as the candidate of the left. And the author, in her article, she referred to herself as an anarchist and said that Yaku Perez, he represents everything that she believes in. He's a liberal. He supports abortion. He's an environmentalist. He is ostensibly an indigenous leader who's actually not really respected by many indigenous communities. So, I mean, we're talking about this strategy is not new, but it's becoming more and more popular, I think, and especially under the Biden administration. I think we're going to see more and more of these kind of like woke coups, just as we see in the U.S. people like Kamala Harris or Hillary Clinton. Remember when she said that if Bernie Sanders breaks up the banks, that won't end racism? Well, we're seeing that same kind of like woke intersectional imperialism now applied to Latin America to try to undermine actual progressive populist left-wing forces.
Well, I think Ecuador is a special case. Nicaragua was sort of a laboratory for this kind of politics through the MRS party, the Movement for the Renovation of Sandinismo, which we've written about a lot. It appeared to be a left-wing party. They said, we are going to fix the authoritarian of Sandinismo, and we're for abortion. They had an ultra-left kind of social democrat wing, Maria Boltadano, and she was heavily supported by, these kind of Ford Foundation type fronts. And, you saw leadership from the MRS go and get training at the Aspen Institute. It was definitely, they were getting, and we revealed at the Gray Zone how they were getting money from CIA fronts like the International Republican Institute for, voter registration and things like that. And it completely failed. In 2006, that was their best performance. It went nowhere. And Ortega was able to run circles around them and really divide the opposition and ultimately sort of force them to...
The MRS has never gotten more than 3% of the vote. I mean, they're totally free.
Yeah, and so by being so unpopular, it forced them to sort of consolidate with the far right Liberal Party, and that really discredited them in the eyes of a lot of Sandinistas. And I think the U.S. sort of underestimated the just deeply ingrained working class anti-imperialism of the Nicaraguan public. But in Ecuador, you have this long-standing project of NGOification, including of the indigenous sector, of pitting indigenous people against the Correa government over the issues of mining and extraction in order to develop the country. CONAI, as you mentioned, has gotten money from the National Endowment for Democracy and was the real front of protests against Correa from a credible demographic that could be marketed abroad. I mean, Guillermo Lasso, he's the banker, he's the neoliberal, he presided over the economic austerity of the 90s. So he's not someone that people in the Western left or the Anglo left are really going to be supportive of. But when you create this third force that has an indigenous kind of progressive pro-choice face, well, that's much more marketable. And you have Yaku Perez saying he always centers water in his public presentation. And he says, water, I'm a water protector. Water is more important than gold. But water, and obviously, yeah, water is important. Like, you have to drink water. But what he's basically saying is that we're going to rely on the IMF for our sources of revenue, and we're not going to develop the country. I mean, that's what it's basically code for. And as you reported, the National Endowment for Democracy has dumped $5 million into Ecuador in the last 3 or 4 years. that's a lot of money. It doesn't sound like a lot of money to people in the US or Europe, but in a small country like Ecuador with, disproportionate part of the population in poverty, that's a lot to basically develop an entire parallel government, an entire parallel civil society to the structure that had existed around Correa. So I guess what I would want you to explain more, because if I had just heard about this trend for the first time, I'd still be confused. What's wrong with someone like Perez who says that he's defending the environment? Why is that such an effective strategy to get behind a green branded candidate who appears riding bicycles in his ads like him for the US? And why is it so particularly successful in Ecuador when it has failed in places like Nicaragua?
Well, I think one of the reasons it succeeded here and not in Nicaragua is the role of so-called extractivism. Look, I mean, the reality is that if you're a very poor country, in Latin America, which is one of the poorest regions of the world, you need to develop your country. And when we're talking about development, we're talking about very basic things. I mean, there are a lot of people in Ecuador and other countries who still don't have access to electricity, running water, sewage. They don't even have roads. And here in Ecuador, I mean, if you're in the big city and people who visit, they'll go to Quito or Guayaquil or Cuenca, but go to the countryside and you'll see that there are people living in extreme poverty. The kind of poverty that, not to downplay how bad poverty is in the US, which is quite bad, but you won't see that kind of poverty. I mean, even the poorest people in the US usually at least have running water and electricity and roads. So the reality is that if you want to develop your country, you're going to have to use those natural resources. The US and Western Europe developed their countries on colonialism and just stealing wealth from the Global South and slavery. And the countries in the Global South don't have the luxury of being able to do that. So Venezuela has used its oil to try to develop the country. And here in Ecuador, they've used oil and mining. And of course, I mean, that has to be balanced with protection of the environment. And Correa is not one of these, Correa has supported environmental efforts. And Andrés Arauz, his successor, I mean, these are smart people who, by the way, I mean, it was the US that withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, and it wasn't Ecuador. So, I mean, these are countries that understand that they have to balance development and extractivism with environmental protections. But it's weaponized against them, their reliance on extractivism to fund these programs. And among certain sectors, especially certain indigenous communities, and among the upper class, liberal, cosmopolitan elites, that has a lot of traction because especially the kind of liberal elites who live in Quito and who have never been in the countryside and don't understand what poverty is, they think that they don't understand that how development works. And they're like, what, we don't need to extract, we should protect the environment. But then the question is, so where are you going to get your revenue from? And they don't have an answer to that. Oh, well, their answer is the IMF, of course. So the reality is that it works for them. And Yaku Perez, he's not a working class candidate. He's the candidate of the kind of liberal cosmopolitan Ecuadorians, like the upper middle class who studied in the United States or Europe, who have maybe dual passports, who speak English. And that's what the MRS party is in Nicaragua, of course. Now, what's interesting, though, about this election is because of the peculiarity of the system and the first round, I mean, Yaku, he doesn't have majority support at all. I mean, he's getting barely around 20%. And, the results, today is the 10th, the results are still kind of being contested. Lasso, it's very, very close. And the CNE has been extremely untransparent. In fact, it's very likely that Arauz won in the first round. And I've heard a lot of people in his circles saying that they think that he won, but the CNE stole the election from them in the first round. A lot of polls showed Arauz around 42 or 43%, which would have, because in Ecuador, there's 2 rounds, but in the first round, if you get over 50%, or if you get over 40% and you're 10% or more higher than the next candidate, so if Arauz got 42 and Yaku got 31, then Arauz would win in the first round. But the reality is that because there were so many candidates splitting the vote, Yaku only got around 20% of the vote, and that probably represents his constituency. It's not that big, But because the vote was split so much, he might make it to the second round. And he's probably going to form an alliance with another neoliberal candidate, this guy Javier Hervas, who is just another technocratic neoliberal drone. I mean, with his, with the suit, and he's like the cardboard cutouts you see that you were talking about. So, but another reason I think that he's gotten so much traction is because he has friends in high places promoting him. I mentioned in this article I published at the Gray Zone, one of the reasons that I became very suspicious of Yaku before the election, before anyone really knew who he was, is because I saw who was promoting him. There was an article published on February 1st in a website called America's Quarterly that promoted him as the face of Ecuador's new left. And I was like, what? This guy is polling at like 13%. Meanwhile, an actual leftist is polling at 43%. How can you say he's the face of Ecuador's new left? That doesn't make sense. Well, what is America's Quarterly?
Let me ask you about that. Let me just set that up here, because I'd also asked about the sort of the strategy. Why is this such an effective strategy for those sorts of elements, business elements? Why don't they push someone directly like Guillermo Lasso? Why are they pushing someone who seems to be the authentic voice of the left? And we saw that, I mean, and you referenced this in your article, we saw that in Bolivia. I mentioned the Amazon fires and the attempt to blame that on Evo Morales. That was part of the fuel for the fire of the coup in Bolivia. And there was a figure named Hanisa Vacadaza, who was also promoted by Extinction Rebellion. I actually called them out at a rally for promoting her and this all these protests that she organized around the world against Morales. And the Extinction Rebellion guy came up to me afterwards, and he had no idea they did that. And he said, every chapter is autonomous. Like, we're not all, involved in this. And why did you call us out? Like, I thought we were allies. And I said, well, I mean, don't be a dupe. And he really didn't know what to say. But so, I mean, maybe they're being duped again, but something funny is definitely going on. And this woman, Hanisa Vacadaza, she was completely tied in with this U.S. intelligence regime change network. I mean,
Human Rights Foundation.
Yeah, the Human Rights Foundation of Thor Halvorsen. You had the Otpor founder, Sergei Popovich.
Popovich, yeah.
Yeah. Popovich, who's now like the rector of St. Andrews, but he for years was training thousands and thousands of activists around the world, working through the Albert Einstein Institute and other shady endeavor.
Of Gene Sharp.
Basically,
that's Gene Sharp's group.
Of Gene Sharp, right? Another shady endeavor. He was involved in the training of Juan Guaido in Generation 2009 in Venezuela, Leopoldo Lopez, all of these figures. And so Vacadaza, she basically helps kick off the coup using the environment as the gear, as the propellant to shift the coup into high gear. And when we were in Bolivia, Ben, we saw graffiti everywhere around La Paz from that time. Evo ecocide was still painted on walls everywhere.
Well, and quick note about Janice Vacadaza. She is the embodiment of this constituency I'm talking about, because anyone who spent time in Latin America knows there's like 10, 15% of the population are like these elite liberal cosmopolitans who are upper middle class and study in the United States. I mean, she studied at a college in Ohio, I believe, and she speaks fluent English, and she's very light-skinned and is part of an elite family who they have dual passports, I think. So, I mean, her great-grandfather was president. Like, these are like the elites of Latin America, but they're like more liberal-minded. They're not like the right-wing, Christian fundamentalists like we saw in Bolivia, but they end up helping the right-wing fundamentalists.
Yeah, they bring that. I mean, you even see it in the Middle East too, especially in places like Lebanon. They come to the West and study in elite camp in elite universities, and then they bring that rad lib politics back to their country to drive a right-wing agenda. They're sort of like the Molly crab apples of the global South. And what she did was very successful, but then she showed her true colors after the coup, and the face of the right-wing, Christianist, fascistic, militaristic coup, Janine Áñez, actually held a meeting with Vaca Daza thanking her, and they posed together, and it was just like mask off, like green mask off, progressive rainbow mask off. I'm with these coup mongers. And that's what I think we're building up to in Ecuador. I should also mention, ahead of the 2018 coup attempt in Nicaragua, which was just a nationwide campaign of right-wing violent terror, it began with an environmental dimension. In the Indio Maiz preserve in northern Nicaragua, there was a fire, and the Nicaraguan opposition attempted to exploit this and claim that the Sandinista government was not a good steward of the environment. But the fire got put out too early because it rained. So it just didn't work, and they had to move to another trigger point, which was the reform of the social security system. They're always looking for a trigger point. Here, the trigger point was an election. So I'm just trying to provide more context for people to understand why green politics is such an effective device for right-wing coup mongers in Latin America. And now you've mentioned this guy, Yaku Perez, who's parading around as champion of the environment, riding a bicycle. He looks like a Green Party candidate in the US, except he isn't white with gray hair. And he is backed at the same time by this group, the Americas Society, Council of the Americas, based in Washington, which is basically the main front for corporate America and Latin America. So talk about that organization. Why is it backing this candidate? Why is it promoting him? And why is it such a pernicious organization?
Yeah, well, you mentioned that in his campaign materials, the photos, you go to his Instagram, Yaku Perez is almost always shown riding a bike at his campaign rallies. I mean, they've been cultivating that image. It goes back years. And to understand where he came from before this presidential campaign, he was a very minor political figure in a province here in Ecuador, the capital of which is a city called Cuenca. That's important because Cuenca has become like a major hub for U.S. expats. And a lot of these kind of like liberal, green, NGO-minded people, you know, they retire to Ecuador, to Cuenca, older couples, because they can speak English. They don't even learn Spanish. And they pay for everything in dollars because dollars are the U.S. currency, the official currency in Ecuador, thanks to Guillermo Lasso destroying the economy in 1999. So his political base, where he started, well, he started with this party Pachakutik, which again it's backed by the United States government. In 2006, they participated in a training program organized by the National Democratic Institute, the NDI, which is an arm of the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, which is a CIA cutout created by Ronald Reagan to organize regime change abroad. So it's important to understand that his political base, when he was elected as a prefect, I mean, he wasn't a National Assembly member. He was basically like, he wasn't even a mayor. I mean, he was like a local representative, a very minor figure in like the whitest, most U.S. government-linked area of all of Ecuador. So his whole shtick about being an indigenous leader and using indigenous clothes and riding a bike, that's not for indigenous Ecuadorians. That's for expats in Ecuador, and it's for the elite liberals here in Ecuador who are linked to the U.S. and who they would be Democrats. I mean, they probably support the Democratic Party. And he really is using that same kind of Democratic Party astroturfed NGO playbook. That's exactly what he's doing. And what really exposes his role as a Trojan horse is what you mentioned, is ESCOA. What is ESCOA? The America Society Council of the Americas is a right-wing corporate lobby group. They have supported right-wing politicians throughout Latin America. In fact, ESCOA played a major role in the so-called anti-corruption campaign in Brazil, the lawfare campaign, legal warfare campaign that overthrew the left-wing democratically elected Workers' Party government of Dilma Rousseff and later installed this unelected neoliberal candidate, Michel Temer, who was an ally of ESCOA. Michel Temer worked very closely with ESCOA. And then, of course, that led to Jair Bolsonaro, who's one of the most fascistic leaders in the world right now. So ESCOA has a very dirty history here in Latin America, but it has been actively promoting Yaku Perez. In fact, in that article I mentioned, the America's Quarterly article, and America's Quarterly is an arm of ESCOA, they actually go out of their way to say that Yaku Perez is more left-wing than Andrés Arauz and Correa. And they refer to Correa as authoritarian and corrupt and an ally of Venezuela. So what they're doing is, they also point out that Andrés Arauz wants better relations with China because Correa worked a lot with China to help develop infrastructure here and fund other projects. And Andrés Arauz wants to reject the IMF. He's going to refuse to pay the over $6 billion of debt that Lenín Moreno has taken from the IMF and instead work with China. Meanwhile, the candidate Yaku Perez, the NGO fake left, he has criticized China, saying that it has a horrible human rights record and he doesn't want to work with China. And at the same time, in an interview a few days ago, Yaku Perez said, this is an exact quote, "I will not think twice about signing a free trade agreement with the United States." So that says everything right there. And that says, and in that America's Quarterly article, they boasted that he's critical of China and wants a free trade agreement with the United States. So, I mean, what kind of leftist wants a free trade agreement with the United States? Moreover, who funds ASCOA? Because I mentioned it's a corporate lobby group. I mean, this for me is the most Orwellian part of this. I mean, it's farcical. To be a member, a corporate member of ASCOA, you have to give them thousands of dollars a year. Who are the corporate members? Basically every major company in the United States. We're talking including top fossil fuel companies, including Chevron and ExxonMobil are members. The arms industry, we're talking weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon are members. Major banks like Bank of America, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and even big tech companies like Apple, Facebook, Google, and of course they rely heavily on mining. You can't make Apple products like iPhones without lithium, without metals. So, I mean, this organization funded by the fossil fuel industry and companies that rely on mining are promoting a so-called eco-socialist candidate as the real left-wing alternative to Correísmo. I mean, it's such a clear astroturfing operation. And you know who's not falling for it? Guillermo Lasso, the right-wing banker candidate. Guillermo Lasso said 2 days before the election, which was another red flag for me, he said, if Yaku Perez is the candidate in the second round, I will absolutely support and campaign for him. So when I saw that, I was like, wait a second, this guy's in third place, he's leading, he's a fringe candidate. How is he going to... Clearly, there were whispers going on, and people thought that he might actually be the candidate. So if he is the candidate, again, they're fighting right now to see who the candidate will be, but if Yaku Perez is the candidate, I guarantee you the entire right wing will unify behind him. We will see the right-wing bankers overnight remarket themselves as environmentalists, just as in Mexico, the progressive president, Andrés López Obrador, AMLO, he joked that because there's been it's a very similar campaign there. The mayor from AMLO's progressive party, Morena, she is a feminist, and she's the mayor of Mexico City, the most important mayor in the country. And her name is Claudia Sheinbaum. And there's been massive protests against her by some of these women's rights groups, even though she's a feminist and even though abortion is legal in Mexico City. But there's been these very violent protests against the government ransacking the Human Rights Office, and they've been supported by the NED and these NGOs that are funded by the US and European Union countries, and backed by Felipe Calderón and his wife, who's the right-wing candidate. So AMLO gave a speech joking. He said, overnight, my right-wing candidates, my right-wing opponents have all become feminists overnight. So I guarantee you that if Yaku Perez becomes the candidate overnight, the right-wing anti-abortion conservatives are going to become pro-abortion environmentalists overnight.
Absolutely. And, it's such a dead giveaway when you know what the Americas Society, Council on the Americas is. I went to one of their meetings back in, I think it was 2018, after I'd been in Nicaragua, and the head of USAID at the time, Mark Green, former Republican governor of Wisconsin, was going to be on stage at the Brookings Institute for an Americas Society meeting where he was just going to trumpet regime change in Nicaragua and Venezuela and promise more money to the right-wing opposition in both countries. I challenged him there, and he gave a boilerplate answer. And then, I realized I was surrounded by, Roger Noriega, who was one of the key coup planners. He was right behind me. He was taking pictures of the back of my head because it was like he didn't have a gun, so he wanted to shoot me with something after my question. And he posting the pictures online. And, I was hearing all these Cuban guys, speaking with, perfect U.S. accents, just literally like planning a coup sitting behind me. H.R. McMaster's chief of staff was sitting to my right. There were all these materials for corporate donors, and I picked up some of the materials, and they were presenting. It was like a menu for corporations who wanted access in Latin America. And if you were,
what it reminds me of is that clip. It's a brilliant, one of the best clips in like American cinema of Godfather Part 2. Where the mafia is meeting with the Batista regime in Cuba right before the Cuban Revolution. And after their meeting with the Batista representatives, the mafiosos, they carve up a cake, and the cake is the shape of Cuba, and each of them takes a slice of the cake and starts eating it. I mean, that's what Escoa is.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's what these menus were. The menu had, gold, platinum, executive. I don't know what the levels were, but if you paid something like $200,000 into Escoa, then you would get direct access to a leader of a Lima Group nation. They would promise you a personal meeting. So Macri or one of these corporate US-backed figures, they would just be on the spot, like guaranteed if you gave this organization that much money, Bolsonaro, whoever. And they run these little summits in Latin America for corporations to go meet with them. And then they say, okay, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and we'll extract minerals and oil from your
It's corporate pay to play.
Country.
I mean, that's what they do. That's what they facilitate.
It's corporate pay for play. And if they're backing Yaku Perez, then he's going to be one of those leaders who's going to meet with the platinum donors or the executive donors. And then they were distributing their magazine, America's Quarterly, the magazine that promoted Perez. And the cover of the magazine was David Smolansky, who's now in Washington as part of this regime change, Venezuelan regime change lobby. And it was promoting him as the Venezuela's leader for the day after. Or, basically they were forecasting the coup because this was before Guaido. But the headline was After Maduro, and it had him, Smolansky, on the cover, this right-wing coup-mongering former mayor of a rich part of a rich city outside Caracas. Anyway, so that's what Escoa is. That's who's promoting him. And then you mentioned that he would agree to a free trade agreement. I mean, we shouldn't even say free trade. It's just corporate trade. And his wife, who you've written about, maybe you can talk a little bit more about her, Perez's wife. She actually worked on the free trade area of the Americas I think it was under Jeb Bush. According to her resume, she worked for Jeb Bush in 2003. And now she's like this, rad femme progressive riding around on a bicycle with like this self-made, purported indigenous leader, so from Jeb Bush to progressive leader, it's an interesting trajectory.
Yeah. I want to read. So in 2013, Yaku Perez got married to a French-Brazilian academic named Manuela Pique. And Manuela Pique is an academic who, as you mentioned, I went through her academic CV because most academics have CVs. So I was trying to do research to figure out who this person is. And in 2003, she worked as a foreign affairs specialist in the Office of International Relations for the governor of Florida. And she didn't name who that was on her CV. That was Jeb Bush at the time. And I should mention, she's not even American. She was living and working for the Florida government. She's French-Brazilian. And then she was also involved, as you mentioned, in the negotiation of the free trade area of the Americas, FTAA, which is incredible because anyone who knows about this was a huge scandal in Latin America. And this is one of the things that actually helped give rise to the so-called pink tide, the wave of progressive governments, because the Bush administration was trying to, it started actually with Clinton, but the Bush Jr. administration was trying to make a massive NAFTA-style agreement for all of the Americas, for North and South America, because NAFTA is, of course, North America Free Trade Agreement. They wanted for everywhere. So basically getting rid of all protectionism, all trade barriers, and just opening up all of South and Central America to U.S. corporations, just to exploit, to use their markets, to destroy agriculture like they did to northern Mexico. I mean, this was a huge factor that led to the rise of the Bolivarian alliance. And in 2003, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, this is a year after the US-backed coup in April 2002, and he's becoming more radical and more anti-imperialist. And Hugo Chavez famously declared that the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas was a form of neocolonialism. And Evo Morales in Bolivia said that if we sign this agreement, the US would forever control us. So that led to, in 2004, it led to Venezuela and Cuba creating the Bolivarian alliance, which was an economic alliance. And then Ecuador joined under Correa, and Bolivia joined under Evo Morales, and then Nicaragua joined when Daniel Ortega returned to power in 2007. So they created an economic trade bloc. Some Caribbean countries joined, and that was one of the huge factors behind the coup in Honduras. And Max, you and I and our colleague Anya, we had an interview with former President Manuel Zelaya, and we met with him and spoke with him. And this is the former Honduran president. And he said explicitly that the U.S. government threatened him and said, you cannot have relations with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and you cannot join the ALBA. If you do, you will have problems. And Honduras joined the ALBA, and months later, there was a military coup to overthrow him. And then what was one of the first things that Lenin Moreno did here when he entered office in Ecuador? After betraying Correa, he withdrew Ecuador from the ALBA alliance. So, ironically, Yaku Perez's wife was involved in negotiating the free trade agreement that gave birth to the ALBA. I mean, it's incredible. And she's portraying herself as some kind of left-wing environmentalist. I should mention that today, she's a professor in the United States. I mean, again, she's actually not a U.S. citizen, but she teaches in the United States. And she's a professor at Amherst College, and she's a professor of Latinx with an X and Latin American studies. And she's the author of books like, these are the titles: Queering Narratives of Modernity, Sexualities in World Politics, and Sex and Tongue in International Politics. So,
Sex and tongue?
Sex and tongue in world politics.
I thought they were, I thought sex and tongue were synonymous, but I guess there's a mutual exclusivity here. I'm using like academic terms. It sounds like she's CIX.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Max said it the best. Like the cadre, the former Jeb Bush employees who become radical environmental, like woke LGBT scholars of sexuality. I mean, like it's so crazy. And I should mention that in Ecuador, Mauela Pic, her name is known by some people. Why? Because in 2015, she was deported from the country, and she turned this into a huge scandal. So I mentioned that in 2013 that she and Yaku Perez got married. Well, at that time, Carlos Perez. They got married, and they were both anti-Correa activists. She was living in Ecuador, teaching at the most elite university, Universidad de San Francisco, here in Quito. And then she was working with the opposition against Correa. She was working with some NGOs funded, as I point out in the article, funded by European governments, the European Union, the Ford Foundation, which is a CIA cutout, and other groups, and trying to undermine Correa. And she got married in 2013 to Carlos Perez, Yaku, but they refused, as a form of protest against the government, they refused to get married in a political ceremony, like a recognized ceremony. Instead, they did a traditional indigenous ceremony, but they refused to go to the courthouse and get registered as a married couple because there was a form of protest. And they were claiming that Correa's racist because he won't recognize this traditional ceremony, even though all they had to do is, they lived in Quito, or she lived in Quito, all she had to do is go to the courthouse and register. It would have taken 10 minutes to be registered. In 2015, she was participating in protests. She was a major leader of protests against Correa. Again, she's not Ecuadorian. She was here participating in massive protests, and she was arrested. I should mention that, of course, she denies a role in violent protests. And I don't think she was participating in violent protests, but I should mention that in 2015, a lot of those protests against Correa were very violent protests, like with guarimba-style blockades and barricades. Anyway, in 2015 in August, she was arrested and she was deported because she had a tourist visa. And because she and Carlos Perez refused to have their marriage recognized politically as a form of protest, she didn't have a residency. She was here on a tourist visa. And according to a tourist visa law, if you are engaged in illegal activity, you can be deported. They'll end your tourist visa. So she was deported from the country, and the European Union backed her. She went to the European Union because she's a French citizen, French-Brazilian, and she became this cause célèbre in the European Union, and all these NGOs backed her and turned her into a martyr, claiming that she was deported for supporting indigenous movements in Ecuador. And she had this massive campaign, and she got a fellowship from a so-called human rights group funded by the European Union, which is an arm of soft power of the European Union. And when did she come back to Ecuador? She came back in 2018 when Lenín Moreno entered power. So, I mean, it's incredible because it just shows these honestly, it's not even just U.S. government. The European Union has played just as pernicious of a role here in supporting a lot of these fake environmental groups and fake left-wing groups. And honestly, that's kind of more like European strategy than American strategy. They often back those like NGO fake liberal or liberal fake left groups. And as much as they claim to be the opposition to the right wing, they constantly are being supported by people like Lenín Moreno, who allowed her to come back in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. The European Union and the Scandinavian-style socialist states play a huge role in Latin America in beefing up this so-called civil society, which exists as a kind of parastate in any country that decides to take a socialist independent direction. And those are the governments that, you know, our progressives celebrate in opposition to Venezuela. You know, AOC says, I'm not a Venezuelan style socialist. I'm a Scandinavian style socialist, without acknowledging the predatory role they play in sort of choreographed fashion with the US.
Or the fact, I mean, I just want to stress this point again, or the fact that a lot of that wealth that Scandinavian social democracy is built on one, extractivism. We're talking about massive oil exports, and the sovereign wealth fund in these countries, you know, Norway, etc., is built on oil exports, and then also weapons exports. Sweden, I mean, these are huge weapons exporters. And
Sweden's one of the top 5 in the world, I believe.
And Max, really quickly, you mentioned an important point about these NGOs and how they undermine governments and how the pink tide governments have tried to clamp down on this. And we saw an example of this this week. This week, the Biden administration released its first official comment on Nicaragua. And it was written by Ned Price, who is an intelligence analyst who's now at the State Department.
He's such a good name. He's named after the National Endowment for Democracy.
Exactly.
I mean, if you name your kid Ned, it's like naming your kid Jeeves. They're going to be a butler. And if they're Ned, they're going to be like a spokesman for something awful.
A spook, yeah.
No offense to any Neds out there. I mean, if your name is Ned and you're watching, like, no offense, but
you're the exception. You're the good Ned.
You're an exception. And, you know, most things named Max are dogs. So anyway.
Well, anyway, so the U.S. Embassy in Nicaragua released this short statement accusing Nicaragua of being on the path to dictatorship because Nicaragua passed a law, the democratically elected National Assembly passed a law requiring organizations funded by foreign governments to register as foreign agents. I wonder where they got that idea. That's exactly the same law that the United States has, that they forced RT to do and Chinese media to do. So Nicaragua passed a law saying, look, these NGOs that tried to violently overthrow our government, or the elected government in 2018, if they're funded by foreign governments, they need to register as a foreign agent. So in response to that, one of the main right-wing foundations in Nicaragua, which is funded by the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy, the Chamorro Foundation, named after Violeta Chamorro, the former neoliberal right-wing U.S.-backed president, they announced that they're closing down in protest. I mean, they could have registered as a foreign agent and continued their work in Nicaragua, but they decided to shut down and portray themselves as martyrs. So the U.S. Embassy released a statement saying that now Nicaragua is on a path to dictatorship and is silencing independent voices because it passed a law that the U.S. has had on the books for decades.
Yeah.
So if you don't allow the CIA to bankroll groups that organize coups in your country, then you're a dictatorship, according to the U.S. State Department.
I mean, this foundation was supporting 100% Noticias, which was the most virulent driver of right-wing violence in 2018. And it played an extremely destructive role that, you know, anyone who hates, any liberal who fears RT, they can't even imagine what the Nicaraguan media was like in 2018. I mean, it was like they would send reporters out to actually whip up rioters and lead them with a camera to their target to burn stuff down. But I wanted to ask you, back to Ecuador, there was a report in La Jornada. I want to just make sure I get it right, but it was by
Colombian media.
Oh, it was in La Jornada, not the Mexican publication, but the Colombian publication by Catu Arconada.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about something else. Yeah, the Colombian media has been spreading this insane lie.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about
that Andrés Arauz is funded by the Colombian socialist guerrilla group, the ELN, which is hilarious because there was the same lie about Correa like 10 years ago. The Colombian media claimed that he was funded by the Colombian socialist guerrilla group, the FARC. But they signed a peace agreement with the government, so now they just changed the name. It's the same article. They Control F took all ELN out and or all FARC out and switched it with ELN. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah, I think there was some video of some masked characters praising Arauz, and it was said to be ELN. And unfortunately for the fabricators, there was a bird in the photo, some kind of grouse that was not native to Colombia, which showed that the video was taken in an entirely different country. But I wanted to ask you about a report from the other side in La Jornada, I believe.
Yeah, that's Mexico.
By Catu Arconada, about the U.S. campaign in Ecuador. He named a figure, Michael J. Fitzpatrick, who is Trump's liaison to Ecuador, who's been meeting with Yaku Perez and others, and has played a specific role in this election. I wonder if you've heard anything about Fitzpatrick's role, who he is, what he's doing, what specifically the U.S. is doing here. What we know, because we know about the history of the U.S., the institutional support for Perez and Lasso's economic relationship with the U.S. But specifically, what do we know about what the U.S. has been doing in the country?
Well, Fitzpatrick is new as the ambassador. He just came in 2019. And he came in under the Trump administration and thus far has continued under Biden. And it's not really, there's not much public, so it's not really known what he has been doing. But what I can say a few things that I found in my research. Yaku Perez had a very friendly meeting with the new U.S. ambassador right after right even before he officially entered. He was officially sworn in and recognized by Moreno as the U.S. ambassador to Ecuador. And there's a photo that Yaku Perez posted. There's actually two photos that he posted on social media showing him meeting with the U.S. ambassador. And then also there's like a really weird photo where it's like one is them sitting in a meeting and one of them is like standing in front of these statues like they're friends or something. It's really bizarre. And then after that meeting, Yaku Perez went to a 4th of July celebration organized by the U.S. Embassy that was also a welcoming celebration to welcome in Fitzpatrick, the new ambassador. And at that meeting, Yaku Perez posed with some embassy staff in front of like this giant, like light up American flag, like this big U.S. flag made of lights. So, I mean, I haven't seen much else. I'm sure that the U.S. Embassy has been up to stuff. I haven't seen what it's been doing. But I mean, I think those two meetings are pretty interesting and pretty suspicious, frankly, especially considering the fact that Yaku Perez has already said that he doesn't want better relations with China, and that he will not think twice about signing an agreement with the United States. I mean, it's pretty incredible because this is the same guy who he has been demonizing, Yaku Perez, for years. He demonized Correa as racist. He called Nicolás Maduro and the Venezuelan Chavista government, he said that they were colonialist and genocidal. He demonized the progressive government in Argentina of Cristina de Kirchner as supposedly corrupt. He demonized the progressive government of Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. So it's incredible that this guy who has supported all of these coups against Venezuela, Brazil, Nicaragua, even his own country, Ecuador, who hates the left across Latin America, it's pretty incredible to see that he'll call left-wingers here in Latin America racists and colonialists, but he never says anything about that about the United States. In fact, he has friendly meetings with the U.S. ambassador. It says a lot to me. One other thing that I've seen from the U.S. embassy, which is really incredible, frankly, is that apparently Yaku Perez told a journalist here in Ecuador that immediately after the election night on the 7th, that the U.S. embassy called Yaku and told him he's going to be the candidate in the second round, which is amazing because the CNE, the National Electoral Council here in Ecuador, still hasn't officially declared who the second place candidate is and who will go to the second round, the runoff. So the U.S. embassy apparently went above the Ecuadorian government and told Yaku that he's going to be the candidate. So, I mean, is Washington deciding who wins Ecuadorian elections? It's incredible.
Do you think that it was fixed? Are people saying it was fixed? I mean, is that the way it seems on the ground?
I'll say that I have heard people in Arauz's inner circle, and Arauz is very diplomatic, but I've heard people in his inner circle who say yes. They think that they won in the first round with 42 or 43%, and that the CNE, which has been extremely antagonistic to them the entire time and almost prevented them from running in the election, they think that the CNE doctored the results, cooked the books. And it's not like Bolivia. I mean, Max, you and I were electoral observers. It was entirely a transparent process there. They couldn't steal it because you could go to the precinct and you could just see the vote count. It's not at all like that in Ecuador. It's a secretive vote count, and you can't really have an independent audit. So it's entirely up to the CNE.
Put on screen what it looked like on election day. I mean, voting, the polls were swamped, just overwhelmed with crowds. It was run horribly, and it was a disaster. Okay, so Yaku Perez is now claiming fraud. They're sending his people out. It looks like a destabilization campaign is underway, and we've pretty clearly established the agenda of what you could call the neoliberal regime that was put in place by Moreno and the U.S. behind it to stop Arauz and the socialist pink tide from returning. I think we've established that. The question is now, I think, whether it's Perez or Lasso as the second round candidate against Arauz, do they come together, and do they have the numbers if they consolidate to actually defeat Arauz?
That's the question. I mean, there's a few questions actually to ask. First of all, the question people are asking is, even if there will be a second round, people might remember that in Bolivia, the coup government there delayed the election 3 times. And the only reason there ever was an election in Bolivia is because the support base, the social movements behind the movement towards socialism party, MAS, they had massive strikes and protests and just brought the country to a halt. And the coup regime was forced to hold an election after delaying it. So here in Ecuador, there's concerns that now the government can say it has democratic legitimacy because it had a first round, but they might delay the second round, and they could use COVID, or they could use a host of different excuses to continuously delay it and delay it and delay it. So if there is an election, the second round on April 11th, the question will be if the vote will be fair. I mentioned that the president of the National Electoral Council, the CNE, is herself a former National Assembly member from Pachakutik, the party of Yaku Perez, and she has overseen a repressive campaign trying to prevent the Correistas from being able to participate. And she also worked at the World Bank. And we saw as well that the CNA was totally politicized by Moreno. So it's very unlikely that they would allow a very free and transparent vote. And then finally, if there is a relatively free election, this comes to your question. And I think it's a good question. We've already seen Yaku Perez hint that he would be willing to form an alliance with this other kind of like fake left, kind of like liberal candidate named Javier Hervas. He is from a party called Izquierda Democrática, the Democratic Left, which is a social democratic party historically, but it's moved more and more to the right, and it's pretty much neoliberal. It's a liberal party. They have already hinted that they would be willing to form an alliance. In the first round, each of them, so far, Yaku Perez, it seems he got around 20%. Hervas got a little over 15%. So if they combine their forces, they would have at least 35%. And then they would probably get a lot of Lasso's vote. Now, the question is, what will Lasso do? I think that it's possible that Perez and his party, Pachakutik, they might try to distance themselves from Lasso because he's so unpopular. I should, again, stress that this is his third election, Lasso. He's really hated. Everyone knows he's extremely corrupt. He's one of the richest people in Ecuador. So it's not likely that he would win in the second round. In fact, I've heard Correistas tell me that they think that it would be easier for Arauz to win against Lasso than against Yaku. Because Yaku, what he'll try to do is he'll make a big tent campaign. He'll represent the anti-Correa movement, the anti-Correísmo movement, and he'll unify the liberal NGO people with the center-right neoliberal technocratic elites. And they might not have like the most openly right-wing elements, but they'll make like a big tent. I mean, like the Democratic Party has done, right? The Democratic Party, I mean, has the backing of most major corporations at this point. Big tech was totally behind Biden, and the big banks were behind not only Biden, but behind Obama. The big banks were some of the biggest supporters of Obama. So, I mean, what they're going to probably do is do the Democratic Party strategy, but the difference is, in the United States, the elections have become between a right-wing, kind of far-right populist and a neoliberal in the US, whereas here, it'll be a left-wing populist, a socialist, versus the neoliberal Big Tent.
Right, right. That's why we see so many comparisons, facile, ridiculous, absurd comparisons in US and Western media between the left-wing populist leaders of the global South and Trump as a way of kind of discrediting them. Like, oh no, they attract large crowds and are charismatic. That must mean that they're bad. Impeach them. So
we want like a technocrat with the personality of cardboard to be our candidate.
Yeah.
Like Anthony Blinken.
Ernesto Zedillo, and then he'll get a special center. Ernesto Zedillo, who signed NAFTA for Mexico, basically signed away Mexico's middle class and fueled the migration crisis to the north. He got a special center for the study of globalization at Yale. And it's just like in this big mansion they just made for him. That's what I thought the meeting with Lenin Moreno was about when he came to Washington about a week before the election or so to meet with OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro, who is like the coup monger in chief, and Juan Gonzalez, who is handling Latin America for Biden at the National Security Council, Marco Rubio, Bob Menendez, the just cartoonish caricature of corruption, also a Cuban American. And they met with Lenin Moreno, and
the director of the IMF met with Moreno.
And the head of the IMF. It looked to me like they were just setting him up to get, a golden parachute after he was pushed out. But now it does seem more conspiratorial. Clearly, we can deduce from that meeting with these pretty powerful figures that this election was extremely important to Washington. In addition, Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, who's now, at this neocon think tank, the Hudson Institute in Washington, he went to Ecuador twice last year. It's unusual. I mean, it's such a small country, wouldn't think that it would play such a big role in U.S. grand strategy, but it was also important because of the WikiLeaks connection, that Julian Assange was given sanctuary at the Ecuadorian embassy in London by Rafael Correa, and that sovereignty was violated thanks to Lenin Moreno basically handing him over, allowing the British police to arrest him. And there was, we reported on the campaign to destroy to literally spy on the Ecuadorian government and infiltrate it. But I mean, Max, I guess what I'm getting at.
One quick point on that, Max. Another element of the Assange scandal that hasn't been stressed a lot outside of Ecuador, because it's more pertinent for people here and it really hits hard at home. Not only was Julian Assange given political asylum by the Correa government, he was also given citizenship. Julian Assange was considered an Ecuadorian citizen.
Right.
And Moreno stripped him of that citizenship in order to kick him out of the embassy. So not only did Moreno allow the British authorities to violate Ecuadorian sovereignty by entering its sovereign territory, which is the embassy, it took away the citizenship of an Ecuadorian, Julian Assange. It's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the same day, Moreno had Olabini, a friend of Assange's who was in Ecuador, arrested on April 11th, 2019, arrested on the grounds that he had played some role in the INA scandal, which basically exposed a massive embezzlement, corruption scandal that Moreno personally oversaw, kickbacks to his inner circle. So Ecuador has become this, I don't know what to call it, sort of a hemispheric focal point or for U.S. infiltration. And the U.S. is clearly very afraid of it returning into the hands of a popular left-wing movement. How important is this election? I mean, we called it a historic election. Why is it so historic? I'm hinting at it here, but maybe you can be more explicit. And why should people who consider themselves leftists or socialists who live in the global north, why should they care about it?
Yeah, Max, you raised really important points that are related to this answer about Pompeo's meetings with Moreno. In fact, Moreno had more meetings with the U.S. president, vice president, and secretary of state than any other leader in Ecuadorian history, which says a lot. I mean, this is a guy, again, who has 8% approval. So he's the least popular president in Ecuadorian history who's had the most meetings with U.S. leaders. It says a lot about U.S. priorities, right? So the answer to your question is, of course, because Ecuador, it's not just because of its economic policy, it's because of its foreign policy. It's a huge element of this. Ecuador is not just part of the so-called pink tide, it is a key player in the movement of progressive governments in Latin America known as the pink tide. Ecuador was the headquarters under Correa of the Union of South American the Union of South American Nations, the UNASUR. UNASUR had its headquarters here in Quito, which were actually kicked out. Moreno withdrew Ecuador from UNASUR and kicked out the headquarters. An incredible attack on the sovereignty of Latin America. For a parallel, UNASUR is kind of like the African Union. It was kind of like a United Nations of South and Central America. And the idea was, if we have a regional dispute, why would we go to another international body like the United Nations, or why would we ask for an arbiter like the United States? Why don't we regionally, with our neighbors, try to resolve our conflicts? So Moreno destroyed that, and then he also withdrew Ecuador from the ALBA. And I mentioned that for the U.S., even above UNASUR, which is a thorn in the side of the U.S. empire, but what really challenges the U.S., what's not just a thorn in its side, but what's like a gunshot to its belly, is ALBA, the Bolivarian alliance, because that's not a political alliance, it's an economic alliance that removes U.S. corporations and the U.S. in general from trade. Because look, the reality is most international trade is still done in U.S. dollars. The U.S. dollar is the de facto global reserve currency. If you are a sovereign government, if you're Nigeria and you want to do trade with Korea, just as an example, you're going to trade in dollars. You're not going to use your own domestic currency. You're going to use the hard currency that you get from international trade that's in dollars and you have in your foreign currency reserves. And the ALBA removed that middleman of the US and the US dollar entirely. And Venezuela and Ecuador were doing trade not only with different currency, but actually they were removing currency. So Venezuela would give a country oil, and the country would give Venezuela coca beans or bananas or whatever. So it was a way to integrate South America economically, remove foreign middlemen who get rich off of that, and try to develop South America with what they call South-South integration. Ecuador was a key part of that. And right after Lenín Moreno entered office, he withdrew Ecuador from the ALBA. So that's one of the main reasons the U.S. is so obsessed with preventing the Correistas from coming back in Ecuador, not only because the Ecuadorian oligarchy and U.S. corporations are profiting, not only because the IMF has been looting the Ecuadorian economy, but also because Ecuador has been a key player in the multilateral regional institutions that the U.S. has been so committed to destroying.
Well, I think that really sets up why Ecuador is such an important piece. It was unusual to me that the U.S. took such a lackadaisical approach to Bolivia when we were there in October. And I think that did have something to do with the Trump administration sort of dropping the ball or being in chaos at the time and focusing entirely on the domestic situation. But Biden says America is back. And I mentioned Juan Gonzalez, who is the NSC, I would say the director of Latin America. He said that the Trump administration was not hardline enough on Nicaragua, that there was no momentum for regime change on Nicaragua. They let him off the hook. So we can clearly see what his agenda is. He's a Colombian American who, rose through the world of academia and think tanks, just like pretty much everyone else in that administration.
I should mention that Juan Sebastian Gonzalez also was in the Peace Corps in Guatemala, which should raise some questions about what the U.S. is doing with the Peace Corps in Guatemala.
Yeah, well, the Peace Corps is a traditional front for U.S. intelligence infiltration across the world. And, there was a high-profile case in Bolivia related to that. So I think that we can see the Biden administration gearing up to try to roll back the pink tide any way they can. It's really important to watch what's taking place in Ecuador. And Ben is still there and will be there. And I guess we'll continue covering it. We've been covering Ecuador for the past 2 years or so, as much as we can. And we're just going to keep our eye on the ball because the empire doesn't sleep either.
Yeah, no, you said it well, Max. I mean, we're gonna keep reporting on it. I have some other interviews I'm working on editing and some other stories, and we'll see. I mean, if the election is going to be held in April, I'm going to try to come back. So we'll definitely go to the Gray Zone, gray with an A, thegrayzone.com, and check out some of our reports. And yeah, I mean, thanks for listening to Moderate Rebels. We're hoping to do more coverage of what's going on in Latin America, because I think it's really important, and especially now with Biden. I mean, all these Democrats freaked out over a lot of Trump's policies, and a lot of them were really awful. But when it comes to Latin America, not only is Biden continuing a lot of them, he might even be accelerating them.
Definitely. And with more credibility and sophistication to do exactly what Trump sought to do. The agenda hasn't changed at all. So thanks a lot for listening or watching. Thanks for supporting us at our Patreon, patreon.com/moderate rebels. Your support has been instrumental in allowing us to do this kind of field reporting to really break the media blockade. So thank you for supporting what Ben's doing and what we're going to continue to do to bring you these kind of dispatches from the field. And we're out.